I'm Jason Sanders, candidate for U.S. Senate from the state of Alabama, Republican. This video is all about the Second Amendment and where I stand on that issue, and that almost seems like something that anybody who would claim to be a conservative or Republican would almost universally agree on. But the reality is, I think the entire state of Alabama has recently been surprised by elected officials that we all believe to hold Republican values, and then seemingly out of nowhere, a gas tax came and was passed without really any consideration to what the people of the state believed. In fact, it was pushed through so quickly there was almost no time for the state of Alabama to really have any kind of debate on this issue. It was just pushed through and that was the end of it. So I'm doing this video so that no one who would be considering voting for me would have any question about where I stand on this issue. Let me start off by saying that I have a plaque that displays the Second Amendment, and I have this plaque displayed in my home. And if you were to come into my home and go into where my master bedroom is, you would find this plaque on the hallway right before you go into my master bedroom. And I'll just read what it says here, although I think most of the voters probably know. It says, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." And also down here below there's a quote from Alexander Hamilton where it says, "The greatest danger to American freedom is a government that ignores the Constitution." And it hangs there to remind me that the Second Amendment was one of the first political issues that I saw being under attack that I believed was a constitutionally guaranteed right that it seemed like the states were almost infringing on in some manner. And I just couldn't understand why the federal government was not stepping up and asserting its authority in this matter. Typically, when we're talking about an overreach of authority, it's almost always the federal government overreaching its right. But in this case, I believe the states are overreaching their authority. And for some reason, the federal government has been pretty quiet on the issue. And so that's an issue that I've taken, which is why I've made this plaque and why I wanted to make this video. So let me just get into the weeds of where I am on the Second Amendment. In case you haven't noticed by now, I'm a pretty big supporter of the Second Amendment and gun rights, but there are some limits on the idea of bearing arms. For instance, I don't necessarily want my neighbor making bombs or having the ability to have maybe a chemical weapon. I mean, obviously we have to draw the line in the sand somewhere. So then we get down into the weeds and we try to figure out where that line exists. And to me, it comes down to something that's pretty simple. We have long established and time-tested norms that seem to be only challenged politically whenever the political wind would seem to blow that direction to benefit one group or another if they were to oppose that issue. And certainly I'm not calloused and unfeeling about the issues that we're having with gun violence, but I'll also say that gun violence in schools, unarmed crowds of people, all these kinds of things are relatively new in terms of the history of the United States and gun ownership. So to that end, we really don't have what I would consider to be a gun problem. I'm a big believer in what we have as a culture problem, and that's something that I think we can address and be much more effective than just disarming citizens. A pretty common response that I hear from that from liberals tends to be, but we're not trying to disarm the citizens, we just want some regulation. And to that I say, there are plenty of places where it's been demonstrated that they are trying to disarm citizens, and I don't really need to go into that, but it's pretty easy to find that there are cities and municipalities where you're not allowed to have this kind of gun or that kind of gun or a gun at all. To that argument, I would say, it starts small and then gets larger and larger and larger, and then pretty soon, one day we just wake up and no one has guns anymore. The other thing I would say to that is that there's definitely been a war on gun ownership for a long time, and opinion has changed on gun ownership for large parts of the country. Many people out there are terrified of a gun, even though a gun is harmless unless it's misused. And so what we're seeing is that continued push and that continued narrative has created a situation where there are a large swath of voters who would support just about any kind of gun control measure that you put out there. So to that end, I would say the left has been very successful in creating an anti-gun mentality among their electorate. But having said that, we have to remember that there's also another segment of the country that still holds firm to those gun rights, and mostly because we understand why we are given those gun rights. It was never about deer hunting or putting food on the table. It was always about the idea that a tyrannical government would hesitate to overrun its own people if they thought the people were armed. And if you don't think that that's true, there's a pretty good example of that from World War II when the Emperor of Japan had considered invading the United States. And it was ultimately decided that that would be a bad move because so many of the citizens were armed. So even if you were able to make it to the shore, and even if you were able to breach the initial perimeters, not only would you have to fight the U.S. military, but you would also have to fight pretty much every civilian out there, because almost every household had a gun of some sort. And so the Japanese Army pulled off of that, and that whole idea was scrapped. The next point I'm going to bring is definitely not going to win me any favor among my local sheriff where I live, but I'm a big believer in the idea that requiring a pistol permit or a concealed carry permit is unconstitutional. As far as I'm concerned, the Constitution of the United States is the only permit that I need to carry. And so the common argument that you're going to hear to that is, but how do you know who's a law-abiding citizen? And to me, that's actually such a simple answer, I almost don't know why it's a question. Almost everybody has a driver's license in the state, and even if you don't, there's still a way around that. But step one, if you've committed a crime and been convicted of that crime, and that crime were one that would keep you from owning a firearm, it's easy enough to put a notation on your driver's license. We already do it with alcohol. I see no reason we couldn't do the same thing with firearms. In addition to the driver's license notation, we already have a system in place called NCIC. The NCIC system would be great because it's already in place today. Pretty much anyone in law enforcement already uses it on a regular basis. And if you don't know what the NCIC is, you're not alone. The NCIC is the National Crime Information Center, and it's what law enforcement uses once a stop has been made to determine if the person that they're dealing with has outstanding warrants or some other issue that they need to be aware of before they have interactions with this person. If the NCIC can be updated pretty much instantly to reflect whether or not someone has an outstanding warrant, I just can't see a reason that we couldn't also indicate on there whether or not a person was legally allowed to carry a firearm. One of the big problems with having to have a pistol permit, I'll just give you a scenario. Let's just say, for instance, that me and maybe a friend or maybe my spouse were outside building a deck or a doghouse or something of that nature, and maybe halfway through the project you realize, man, I've ran out of screws or shingles or boards or whatever it is. And so you say to whoever's helping you, hey, just take my truck, go to the hardware store, and pick us up some XYZ, and you don't think about the fact that you keep a pistol in your vehicle. All right, a lot of people do that. A lot of people keep pistols in a vehicle. Now, the argument can be made that it shouldn't be left in there or that it should, but the reality is, if whoever that person is leaves in your vehicle, they get pulled over, the officer begins to ask a few questions, you say, hey, it's not my vehicle, I don't know where the insurance information is. You open the glove box, and right there's a firearm. You don't have a pistol permit. Now you have a weapons charge, and that just doesn't make sense. You have somebody who's not intending to break any law, according to the Constitution of the United States, shouldn't be illegal in the first place, and now they're going to jail over what really amounts to an honest mistake that shouldn't have been a mistake in the first place. And that's just one possible scenario. There are any number of other scenarios that I could cook up that would lend a similar result to somebody, maybe a loved one or a friend, unintentionally. And so as far as I'm concerned, that's something that definitely needs to be fixed, and I think the easiest way to fix that is to just simply drop the requirement for a pistol permit. Requiring someone to buy a pistol permit is the same thing as taxing or infringing on the right to own the gun, and so I think that needs to go away. And lastly, I'm going to talk about one that's probably going to raise a few eyebrows, but I'm just going to go ahead and say that the term law-abiding citizen, to me, I don't know that we're necessarily 100% right when we just simply say if you're a felon, that's how we make that definition. For instance, maybe someone committed a felony when they were 18 or 19 or 20, and today, they're 45 years old, have a family, a good job, have never, other than maybe some traffic citations, had any kind of issues with the law. And so I just don't see any reason a person like that could not get a path to gun ownership back. And just in case some of you out there are thinking, wow, you're really running off the rails here, think about the fact that during my military service, I used to have to sit through briefing after briefing after briefing where they would explain to me the things that would disqualify me from being able to serve in the military. And one of those things was constantly talked about was called the Lautenberg Amendment. Now, the Lautenberg Amendment is well-intentioned. It basically states that if you're convicted of a domestic disturbance or domestic abuse, then you can't own a gun or even touch a gun, and therefore you're not really worth much to the military, so you can't serve in the military. And on its face, that makes a lot of sense, and I would support that. But what we've seen is that law has been largely upheld the way that it should, but there were a lot of warnings about things that would constitute a Lautenberg Amendment, and I'm not sure how often these things were applied. But the fact that we were being warned about it from our legal department tells me that it at least has happened, or there's a concern that it could happen. And so just take, for instance, if you were to getting a shouting match with a neighbor over something, no violence, no actual physical altercation of any kind, just a shouting match, that could constitute a violation of that amendment, and now you are charged with a domestic disturbance, and now you're no longer allowed to serve in the military because you can't own or carry a weapon. And to me, that's kind of nonsense. it's probably human nature to disagree. And if somebody shouts at you, the immediate reaction is to just raise your voice back because you want to get your thoughts out there just as much as that other person does. And suddenly, you're not allowed to own a gun. That just doesn't make any sense to me. So I think I'd like to see a situation where we pull back on some of this stuff and we do things that make sense and less things that are just based off of some knee-jerk reaction because maybe some senator or some congressman wanted some brownie points somewhere, so they wrote some sort of bill just to get some notoriety. Now, certainly I don't want anybody to misunderstand. I definitely believe the part of the Second Amendment that says law-abiding citizen as well. So as far as I'm concerned, that's going to come down to violent criminals and not necessarily just a blanket term of felon. Also, I would be not opposed to some path to getting your gun rights back if you've demonstrated a level of maturity that maybe you didn't have when the incident took place. And lastly, I just don't want to see a scenario where the states are creating criminals because they're requiring a pistol permit even though the federal government guarantees you that right constitutionally. So if you feel like I feel and you think that it's time to send regular people to Washington to govern, then I'm going to ask for your support, and I'm going to ask you to head over to timetestedpolitics.com and see what you can do to support me. The very first thing that I'll ask is you can go ahead and click that donate button. Campaigning is expensive. There are monetary thresholds that I have to meet in order to be able to put my name on the ballot, and I'm still climbing toward that goal now. So any amount that you can donate is helpful, no matter how small you may think it is. Any amount helps. The second thing you can do is if donating is just not in the cards, that's perfectly fine. Just share this video with people. One of the things that helps me get donations is name recognition and brand awareness. At the end of the day, it's hard to get a donation from someone who doesn't believe that you have the staying power or the ability to go all the way. So the more people who know my name, the more likely I am to raise the money and meet those thresholds and make it to Washington and try to bring a little bit of common sense back into government. And of course, the last thing you can do to show your support is just vote. I think too many people have forgotten that your politicians most of them are not elected leaders. They are elected representatives. So when you go and you cast a vote and you send people to Washington or to the state or to whatever government position it is that you're voting for who represent you, we create a better nation for all of us. So until next time, this is Jason Sanders, U.S. Senate candidate from Alabama, Republican.